He stood up to and stared down the U.S. and French military. He dared whaling ship captains to fire their harpoons while he ran interference to save the whales. And he took on numerous campaigns where he put himself in harm's way. His motivation was to save the planet. He fell out with the very environmental organization he helped create, and he is one of BC's most controversial legends. Patrick Moore never shied away from standing up for what he believes to be the truth. Thank you, Patrick, for joining us for today's conversation. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Carol. Thank you very much for choosing me for this series.
When I look at the arc of your life story, it looks like controversy is sort of your best friend. You've been very involved with controversy throughout your life, whether it was joining Greenpeace, leaving Greenpeace, talking about climate change, carbon, whatever it is. Were you like that as a kid?
Yes, I've always been very much interested in finding out how things work. I grew up on a float camp in Winter Harbor with no road to it on the north end of Vancouver Island. And so I was on the tide flats, down the dock, in the bush all the time. And I didn't realize that I was developing such a love for nature. I mean, I wasn't philosophical as a child, I suppose, and not many are. But as I grew older, I realized that science and nature was my calling, and that I just wanted to know how this world works. And I guess the reason I'm involved in controversial subjects is they are the ones that need to be resolved and understood.
When you look at controversy, though, that takes strength to stand up and say, I think my approach is right and your approach is wrong, or to disagree with people. Where did that strength come from in you? Is it your parents?
It was very much my parents who taught me how to think about the world. They were both prolific readers, things. And then when I was about 11 or 12, they bought me the books of knowledge, which were about 20 volumes, maybe this much reading. And I became interested in the solar system from reading these books and studying all the planets, and I even made a little book of my own with all the statistics of the diameter and the distance from the sun and what they're made out of and all of that. So that was sort of the beginning of my inquisitiveness about nature. And I don't know why it is that there are always so many myths that are wrong, incorrect. And all through history there have been movements, cult movements, religious movements, etc., that just don't have it right about how the world actually works. And we're in one of those periods now, I believe, where people are simply accepting that the Earth is going to go into a climate crisis. And climate emergency is being declared by governments at every level, from little cities, little towns, to cities, to states, to whole countries, especially in the West, because this is more or less a Western, European and North American, and throw New Zealand and Australia in there with it. That's where the climate emergency appears to be coming to people. I think that's absolutely and totally incorrect. Just so happens that since the peak of the Little Ice Age around 1700, which was a really cold period for the Earth where people starved and crops failed, we came out of that in 1700 and it started warming gradually, and it's still warming gradually.
But what about these events? Do you not see more extreme events, whether they're forest fires or hurricanes or floods? Do you see more extreme events?
There aren't more extreme events. There's always been extreme weather events, but they aren't more extreme or more numerous now than they were a century ago or 2 centuries ago. Even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change states very clearly that there are no major trends in extreme weather events. So the very basis of science is observation. That is the first thing in a discovery, is observation. You have to see it, either with your eyes or with a microscope or with a Geiger counter. You have to detect it. You have to see that it's there and exists. And then there is verification. So you see something and you see what it's doing, and you say, I wonder if it'll do that again under the same circumstances. So verification is to repeat that, to see if there's a cause-effect relationship, to repeat it until you say, yeah, I think I'm onto something here. That's a hypothesis in science. And then you let it be known to the rest of the world, and replication is the next and final step in verifying the observation. Replication is when other people do what you did and get the same result. And so science is that simple.
So you look at science, you're a scientist, and make these observations, and people who perhaps don't follow it very closely, all they see is doom and gloom, and the world's about to end, 10 years, 12 years, whatever it is. You're optimistic about the environment? You're optimistic about society, are you?
I'm not terribly optimistic about society or politics at this juncture. We've just come through a situation where the two most powerful countries in the world conspired and financed the creation of a disease that is killing people all over the planet. This is one of the greatest crimes against humanity that's ever been committed.
Elaborate.
Well, the COVID virus was created in a lab in China with funding from the United States and China. Fauci led that funding and gave it through another organization to go to the Wuhan lab. Why did they do this? Why did they make a virus infectious to humans that was not previously infectious to humans? We know they did it. And there is no doubt that these people did this. Why did they do it has never been answered. Like, did they do it so that if it ever happened naturally, we'd know how to deal with it? But there's no evidence that this would have evolved into a human disease. And they made it into one on purpose. So you asked me whether I had hope for society. I just can't understand why something like that could ever happen, but it did. With regard to the Earth, though, I'm quite optimistic about the Earth. The Earth doesn't need us, but the Earth isn't afraid of us either.
So you are at the conclusion that you're pessimistic about society and worried about society, optimistic about the environment and the Earth. So when you stand up and you have all kinds of experts and other folks saying you're wrong, how do you convince people that you're the voice that they should listen to? Why are you right and all those other folks are wrong?
Oh, well, I don't know why I'm right and they're wrong. That's a pretty tough question.
And of course, with controversy comes criticism. So lots of people are very personal in their attacks on you. How do you absorb that criticism, or do you care?
Well, you do care somewhat when people smear you. I get an awful lot of ad hominem, attacking the person rather than attacking what they're saying or going into the logic of what they're saying. They say I'm in the pockets of big oil, for example. I actually have never worked for big oil. I've worked for lots of different industries. Big oil actually is trying to go along with this whole thing for some reason. I think the reason they're doing it is because they know there's no possibility we're going to give up fossil fuels. So they're just playing along with the game. But it doesn't help much. It's kind of like resistance from behind. When you have the people who are responsible for producing the material and substance going along with the climate narrative and saying, oh yeah, we'll do our thing. We'll bury CO2 in the ground and we'll build solar and wind plants because they have all the money in the world to do it. So that makes it rather complicated, and that's political.
Do you pay attention to social media, or do you just say, close that door?
No, I have 100,000 followers on Twitter, and my book is selling very well. It's been in the top 10 books on Amazon in the US and Canada, and now in the UK, so the English-speaking world, basically. I can't obviously explain 210 pages, 11 chapters on 11 subjects in an interview. So people will have to read the book if they want to really understand where I'm coming from. But I can tell you that it has over 1,200 reviews on Amazon already, and it's 95% positive. The negative reviews are almost always personal attacks on my character or whatever.
Has it affected your family over the years? Criticisms?
Yes, but only my immediate family, I suppose. But my wife and my 2 sons understand what I'm doing and know that what I'm doing is right.
So here we are, and you're not afraid to stand up and say what you think. Did you really call AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a pompous little twit?
Yes, I did.
How did that happen?
She was being pompous. She said, "I'm the boss." That was a quote from her that I was responding to. I'm the boss. And she was talking about a subject that she has absolutely no expertise in, which is science in general. And so this whole group, what are they called?
The Squad?
The Squad, yes, the Squad. They are extremely pompous. They are like overly egotistical to the extent that it makes you want to call them twits. It worked really well in the media in the States because pompous little twit is kind of like an English expression as opposed to an American one, right? And so it seemed quaint to them, I think.
There was a time, of course, when you and the environmental movement were holding hands very closely when you first joined Greenpeace. What drove you, looking back, to become part of the movement?
The threat of all-out nuclear war, which was a real thing as opposed to the climate emergency. The weapons buildup, particularly by the US and the Soviet Union, as it was called at that time, really did pose a threat to the whole of civilization, an ominous threat. And so, as a PhD student in ecology, I decided I'd like to do something rather than just read books and go to class. And I heard about this group, the Don't Make a Wave Committee, that was beginning to meet in the Unitarian Church with the idea of planning a voyage in a boat to the Aleutian Islands to protest the US hydrogen bomb testing. And so the idea was to take on the world's most powerful organization, the United States Atomic Energy Commission, and the CIA and all the rest of it. And we did it. And we stopped hydrogen bomb testing by the United States in Alaska. I would say that Greenpeace in that case was just part of the overall movement, but we were the part that was at the tip of the spear in a boat going across the ocean and getting on Walter Cronkite for doing it and causing the border to be closed from people marching from both sides on the day the bomb exploded. And President Nixon canceled the remaining hydrogen bomb tests. So we stopped hydrogen bomb testing. Then we stopped French atmospheric nuclear testing, in that case in partnership with people in New Zealand, but they were just marching in the street. We were out in boats again and going to the Notre Dame and going to the Stockholm Conference on the Environment and getting New Zealand to vote to put it on the floor against the wishes of the nuclear weapon states to condemn French atmospheric nuclear testing, which they did, which passed in an overwhelming vote and embarrassed all the nuclear powers, especially France, and they stopped atmospheric nuclear testing, and we stopped them. We did that. We also stopped the killing of 30,000 whales on the high seas every year. It took 4 voyages, all of which I was on. 2 of them I was the leader of, and we stopped 30,000 whales from being killed.
So with all of that success, why leave Greenpeace?
By the mid-1980s, we had become a very large business. We had a huge fundraising program. We had a lot of employees. We had a lot of politics. And we had basically resolved most of the pressing issues that we had set out to, because the last 5 years, or even the last 7 years, was mostly focused on toxics. We cleaned up the rivers of Europe because they were dead. North America, both Canada and the US, had adopted pretty good air and water pollution laws in the early 70s, whereas Europe did not, and neither did Britain. And so we sailed a boat up the rivers and plugged the pipes of factories underwater that were spewing toxics in. And that saved the rivers of Europe. They're all full of fish today. So that was sort of mid-80s. Two things happened to Greenpeace. First, it was more or less taken over by the radical left because they recognized it was a powerful fundraising and political movement that we had created. And most of us were amateurs at a political level. We were all different professions. And I was the only one with any formal science education in the International Board of Greenpeace at that time. From '79, when we created Greenpeace International, till '86 when I left, there were no other science-educated people there. They were political activists, social activists, entrepreneurs looking for a career in environmentalism, because now you could actually make a living with the money coming in. And the two things that happened that caused me to leave was, at a philosophical level, we had started out with a strong humanitarian orientation to stop all-out nuclear war and thus save civilization. Those are people. So we cared about the people. By the time I left, the environmental movement and Greenpeace as well were referring to humans as the enemies of nature, the enemies of the earth, sort of as if we were the only evil species and all the other ones were good, even the bad ones. I mean, the ones we don't like.
Did they use those words?
Yes, enemies of the earth. They used those words. They still use those words. And because that's how they see it. They see that humans, that's why the only reason the world is going to come to an end is because of what we're doing, right? That's what they're saying. And it's sort of like original sin in religion. It's like we are born evil type thinking. It's a really dark, cultist kind of approach to things, to think that we're the only bad people, bad species. It's simply ridiculous to say that. But the sharp end of the stick, that was philosophical, of course, but the sharp end of the stick was that my fellow directors all agreed that we should have our next campaign to ban chlorine worldwide. The element chlorine, one of the 94 natural elements that the universe is made of, and also the most important element for public health and medicine. So adding chlorine to drinking water was the biggest advance in the history of public health, and swimming pools and spas to kill the bacteria, what called waterborne communicable diseases like cholera. And 85% of our pharmaceuticals are made with chlorine chemistry, and about 25% of them actually have chlorine in them.
So Greenpeace wanted to ban
chlorine worldwide. And the reason they did is because they knew that many of the chlorinated hydrocarbons, such as DDT and dioxin and others, are toxic, should not be spewed into the environment. And the common element they saw there was the chlorinated part. But, you know, salt is chlorinated sodium, and it's an essential nutrient for us to exist. So I said, you've got to have a slightly more nuanced approach to this, you guys. Yes, if there's certain compounds which contain chlorine, but you shouldn't really single chlorine out. There's lots of other compounds that don't contain chlorine that it should also not be put into the environment in large quantities and cause pollution. I just don't see the reasoning for a campaign to ban chlorine worldwide.
And so they didn't like that? You didn't like that?
They carried on with it. Today, they try to deny they did it. And it's all in it, but there's too much archival material showing in newspapers that they have a campaign to ban chlorine worldwide.
You have been described by Wikipedia as a former activist.
Yes.
It makes me laugh.
Yeah.
You're obviously still an activist.
I have always been an activist. There was a period when I started a salmon farm after I left Greenpeace, thinking I was doing something really good, and then I find myself being attacked by Greenpeace for being a salmon farmer. And as you know, in British Columbia, it's very controversial.
But you are still an activist. There are so many issues we've talked about that you care about, you have opinions about, you're a spokesperson for. When you look back on your life story, what do you see as your legacy?
Well, my books are my legacy. I've written 3 books. Trees Are the Answer was the first one. I'm going to republish it because I think it's still just as relevant as it was in '94 when I first published it, and it's been through 3 printings, and it's out of print now. Trees Are the Answer is something everybody should understand to get a balance on that subject, because trees are the answer to everything from what is the most sustainable, renewable, and practical thing to build our houses with, all the way to how can we make the earth more green and beautiful. And in between that is the habitat that forests provide for most of the species in the world, and the fact that they clean the air and they clean the water in the soil. They make the soil. People think trees are eating the soil. No, they are what made the soil. There wouldn't be any soil if it wasn't for the trees and the other plants. They'd just be rocks.
So your advice to young people today, what would it be, if you could put it in a sentence or 2?
Critical thinking. Learning how to do critical thinking, the first rule of which is never believe a story where the headline or the first paragraph contains the words if, may, or might. Sorry, not if. May, might, or could. And because it should say may or may not, might or might not, could or could not. Because those are not predictions of anything. They are kind of biased opinions that something may happen, when in fact it may not happen. But they never put the or may not, or could not in the sentence. And critical thinking requires understanding the words that are being used more carefully than most people do.
Thank you for today. I appreciate it. Thank you,
Carol.
As you can see, Patrick is passionate about nature and the world we live in. On his website, he says, "I love nature and people are a part of nature, all people and all living things. I believe in one human family, and that requires international communication and trade." Well, you can be sure that he will be trading his insights and perspectives through a wide range of communication channels for many years to come. Patrick Moore, a BC legend.